everyone! Today we are going to be combining two really important concepts in Bash scripting. Firstly is flow control, and the second is data structures. So we'll start by looking at the case statement, and then we'll move on to working with arrays. Just as a refresher, we have these flow control statements. So we've got the while loop, which executes code repeatedly as long as a certain condition is true. The until loop, which is the opposite of the while loop, so it runs as long as the condition is false. And we have the for loop, which simply executes a block of code for each item in a list of values. And we have this case statement, which is the focus of this part of the video. And this is similar to an if statement, but it provides a much cleaner way to branch between multiple different situations. So if you're coming from Java, you might already know about the switch statement. Python, however, doesn't strictly have an equivalent, but Bash uses the case statement to handle this logic. Syntactically, we start with the case expression, and then you list your patterns, and each pattern is followed by a closing parentheses. So as you can see here, we are declaring an integer variable with a value of 4. Then we have this switch statement, which evaluates the day variable. Then we have our case. So if the day equals 6, execute this code, which is going to simply print out that today is Saturday, and then exit the switch statement. However, if the day is 7, then it's going to print that today is Sunday, and then we'll break the case statement. And finally, we have our default, which catches all other values that are not matched by our specific cases here, so 6 and 7. In general, the case expression in right here opens the case statement. Expression here is the variable that's being evaluated. Then we have pattern 1, which is the first pattern to match against the expression. We also have statements with the 2 semicolons, which means that the code will be executed if pattern 1 matches, and otherwise we have these 2 semicolons to end the case branch. Then we have pattern 2, which is similar, and we can continue on with additional patterns if we'd like. And then finally we have case spelled backwards, which closes the case statement. Now, unlike Java, Bash doesn't need explicit break statements. However, we do still need to make sure that we have these 2 semicolons in order to separate each case branch. So what I'd like you to do is, on your own, try creating a weekend.sh script with this code. And then finally, here's a little bit more of a complex example, which is that we use read-rp to prompt the user for their favorite color. Then we open the case statement and have these conditions based on what the user puts in. And then here is our default, which is that asterisk. And we'll say, sorry, I do not know that color, if the user gives a color that is not one of these here. And again, we're just using this case statement because it's a lot cleaner than writing 5 different if-else statements. Now let's switch gears to arrays. In Bash, arrays are 0 indexed, so that means that the first element is at position 0. And essentially what an array is a way to store multiple values in one variable. So to create an empty array, we simply have this syntax here. We can also initialize an array by putting specific values in here. Notice we don't need commas like we might need in Python. If we want to retrieve the third element, we can use this syntax, and again, remember that since arrays are 0 indexed, we have a 2 here instead of a 3. To get all of the elements in an array, we can use this syntax here, and in general, you can see the rest of the syntax for arrays. So what I'd like you to do is open a terminal and type these different things and just take a look at the output so that you're familiar with how arrays work syntactically in Bash. Now let's create a little script. If you're at your computer, I would encourage you to code along. If not, I'll just explain what is happening at each stage. So we'll start by creating an empty array named pets, and then assign a string called dog to index 0 and cat to index 1. So that's going to be the first and second elements of our array respectively. And then we ask the user for their favorite animal and read it into index 2 using the syntax here. Now finally, we're going to loop through the array, and there are a few ways to do this. So in this example here, we can iterate by element. For pet in all of the elements, we can get the value of the pet directly. So again, that's that first example here. We can also iterate through the array by index. So this gives you the index numbers, which you can use to look up the value. So see here, we're looking up the value, and you can see that we're using a for I in pets for those indices. And then finally, we can use this C style loop, which calculates the length of n using this syntax right here. And then you can run the standard C style loop right here. Here's another example. If you'd like, you can take a second to pause the video and look through it more. But essentially, it's just a simple calculator where we prompt the user for two numbers and then store them as numbers at index 0 and index 1. And then we're going to add them together and print the result. In terms of assignments, what I'd like you to do is go fork the max score repo from our class organization and then clone it. And you're going to be following the same general steps that you normally follow. And what this script should do is simply read 5 positive integers from a user and then store them in an array, iterate through the array to find the highest score and display it, and then finally display all of the scores again, but this time printing the difference between each score and the highest score. Here is a Java example to help you with the algorithm. You'll see that we initialize a max variable to the first element at score 0 and update it whenever it finds a larger number. So again, you can pause here if you want to take a look at this logic. To finish up, make sure that your script is executable and passes this audit. You can also test it with the included max score input file that is in the GitHub repo. Also be sure to edit the README file and then go through these changes that we've talked about in terms of pushing to GitHub. And then finally, you'll want to create a Jenkins job in the max score projects folder and then post a link to your console output from Jenkins to Canvas. All right, everyone, that's it. Have a good day.